The airport was alive with sound and motion. Rolling luggage, soft intercom beeps, boarding announcements, hurried footsteps, the buzz of conversations layered over coffee orders and phone calls. A boy ran past, dragging a stuffed bear. A woman scolded her husband for forgetting passports. Travelers hurried, some drowsy, others laughing, all unaware of what was about to stop the world for a moment. Then the soldier walked in. He didn't push through the crowd or demand attention. He didn't have to. His presence carried a silence so full it swallowed the noise. Every movement of his was intentional, slow, upright, deliberate. He wore the deep blue dress uniform of a tomb guard, each stitch precise, each badge gleaming, under the lights. His cap sat firm on his head, his chin slightly lifted, and his white-gloved hands held a folded American flag, like it was the last fragile memory of someone great. He walked toward the terminal gates, alone, but clearly on a mission. People began to notice, not all at once, but like a quiet wave. First a few glances, then a pause in conversation, then a hush. A toddler stopped crying. A businessman lowered his phone mid-sentence. A woman with headphones took one off. The soldier didn't look left or right. He kept walking with silent gravity, as if he were bringing something sacred through a world that had forgotten how to see it. At the security checkpoint, a staff member stepped into his path. "Excuse me, sir." "Can I help you?" The soldier presented his orders. "I'm military escort, accompanying a fallen service member." The staff member looked at the documents, squinting. "This says you're carrying ceremonial duty. Where's the body?" "Being transferred to the cargo hold of the flight. I'm to accompany it to the gate, board, and receive it on the other end." Another voice behind the staffer said, "That's not standard. We don't usually allow people past the barrier unless—" The soldier didn't move, didn't blink. "I was requested by the family. My orders come from above." A TSA supervisor joined them, called in by radio. He was sharp, skeptical, all protocol and clipboard. "We can't verify these authorizations. We'll need to contact the airline, clear it with management, and confirm handling protocols. You'll need to step aside for now." The soldier looked him in the eye. Calm, resolute. "I cannot step aside." "Sir, with all respect, this is not Arlington. This is a civilian terminal. You are not authorized to stand guard here." "I do not require authorization to honor the fallen." The supervisor sighed. "You're not following orders. Said the soldier. "Just not yours." Tension thickened. Behind them, travelers were no longer pretending to ignore it. Some had stepped out of line. A young mother clutched her child tighter. An older man in a leather jacket with a Vietnam service patch stood a little taller. The air grew tight, the quiet deeper than before. A security officer appeared next. "Will need you to move aside, sir?" The soldier's voice didn't rise. He simply said, "No." Before anything could escalate further, the crowd shifted again. An elderly woman stepped forward, slowly, leaning on a cane, with silver hair pulled tight in a bun. A star-shaped pendant hung on her chest, shining dully under the fluorescent light. Her eyes, watery but steel, fixed on the soldier. "I asked for him." Her voice was soft, but the entire checkpoint went silent. "That casket belongs to my grandson," she said, "and I asked for someone who knows how to honor a soldier. That young man came because I asked him to." The supervisor froze. "Ma'am, do you want to be the man who tells a grandmother that her boy's final wish gets denied because of a clipboard?" The supervisor looked down, then stepped back. The soldier didn't say anything. He bowed his head to the woman. She walked beside him, slow and proud, her cane tapping with each step as the crowd around them moved aside. That's when something extraordinary happened. A boy took off his hat and stood up straight. A middle-aged man placed a hand over his heart. A flight attendant whispered into her comm and stepped out from behind the gate. A janitor dropped his mop and stood at attention. The entire terminal started forming lines. not because they were told to, but because something inside them told them it was the right thing. An unspoken formation began, a human hallway formed, and the soldier walked through it with the grandmother beside him. No orders shouted. No crowd control, no commands, just honor. At the gate, the airline staff, faces streaked with tears, stood waiting. One extended her hand but pulled it back, overwhelmed. The gate agent nodded. "Board when ready. Everyone's waiting. No." Priority boarding. No special groups, only silence and respect. The soldier and grandmother stepped onto the jet bridge. Every seat was filled. Every passenger sat in silence. A woman who had been sniffling softly reached for a tissue. A child on her lap looked around confused, but somehow understood he should stay still. The captain came out of the cockpit and stood with his hand over his heart. "We are honored to carry home one of our nation's heroes today. We thank you for your silence as we escort him and his guardian to their seat. You'll be invited to disembark after they exit." The flight took off with no further announcements, no clinking glasses, no small talk, just flight. When the wheels touched down, passengers remained in their seats. Nobody reached for bags. Nobody stood. The soldier stood and waited. Outside the window on the tarmac, a color guard stood ready. A hearse waited quietly, polished and solemn. The casket was retrieved and gently placed beneath the open sky, and the soldier walked again, this time behind the casket, not beside it. Step for step, with the same poise he'd shown at the tomb, guarding the nameless, walking with the known. On the other side of the tarmac, the fallen soldier's parents stood with shaking hands. The mother sobbed into a folded flag. The father saluted with trembling pride. The grandmother stood beside them, clutching the pendant around her neck. The soldier didn't speak. He didn't need to. When the casket was loaded into the hearse, he saluted once more. A long, perfect salute. A salute for one, a salute for all. A salute for the forgotten and the remembered alike. And then he stood still, because that was his duty, to stand, until it was finished. No one clapped, no one moved, only tears, only reverence. Hours later, someone taped a sheet of paper near the gate with black marker scrawled across it. It read, "One man refused to let a hero walk alone. He stood, so we all would remember." That paper stayed up for days, until someone turned it into a bronze plaque. No date, no names, just the words. He walked with the fallen. We followed with our hearts. The plane had long emptied. The runway crew had finished their solemn duty. The hearse had pulled away, slow and steady, like the fading note of a song that leaves silence ringing in the air. The soldier stood for several more minutes, alone on the tarmac, still in posture, his uniform now slightly touched by wind and dust, but not his focus. Then came a quiet shuffle of feet behind him. It was the pilot. "I've flown nearly 30 years, the man said, removing his cap, voice hoarse. "But I've never seen something like that. Thank you for what you did." The soldier didn't turn, but he acknowledged the words with a small nod. The pilot stepped closer. "You know, you gave everyone on that flight something to carry. They won't forget it." And they didn't. Passengers began to post online, not photos, but words, long messages, raw ones. A teacher who had watched in silence wrote, "I came home changed. I saw what honor looks like in real time." A teenager on spring break posted, "I used to think respect was just about saying yes, sir. But now I know it's about standing still when someone else deserves your attention. More than you." One post was shared over 2 million times. It read, "I boarded Flight 287 tired and distracted. I left it understanding reverence." One soldier stood tall, and in doing so, he made all of us feel small, but in the best way. "I didn't even know the name of the man in the casket, but I know this. He mattered, because someone showed me how much he mattered." At the funeral, 3 days later, the same soldier stood again. This time he didn't walk, speak, or salute. He just stood beside the casket as mourners wept and family members collapsed under grief. Even when the bugle played its final note and the rifles echoed through the open field, he didn't move. The mother of the fallen soldier came up to him after the ceremony. She was holding the flag now, clutched to her chest like a lifeline. "You walked him home," she said, voice cracking. "You brought him all the way," he nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. He never should have walked alone. She placed her hand on his shoulder and whispered something else. Only he heard it. Only he would carry it. After that, he faded quietly from the public eye. No press, no interviews. He returned to the old guard and resumed his post at the tomb. Of the unknown soldier, his duty never broken. Day after day, hour after hour, he walked the mat. Rain, heat, snow, silence. But something had changed. People started coming more often, not just to witness the precision, but to feel the weight of what it meant to never leave a soldier behind. Children pointed and whispered, "That's the one from the airport." Veterans cried quietly near. The chain rope, hand over heart. And every now and then, someone left a folded piece of paper instead of flowers. Just words. Thank you notes to a man who never asked for recognition. One read, "You didn't speak." "But I heard everything," another said. "My brother was never escorted home, but in you, I saw what he deserved." Time passed, seasons turned, and then something rare happened. A call came down from the top brass, a proposal. They wanted to build a statue, not to glorify war, but to honor a moment, a single instant when a man in dress blues stood still so the world would remember someone else. The soldier declined the statue. Instead, he offered a different idea. "I'm not the story," he said. "The story is what happened around me. People stood up. People chose reverence. That's what should be remembered." So a new memorial was built. Not a statue, but a stone pathway, lined with the names of fallen soldiers whose flights were once silent. Etched into the middle, in simple block lettering, are the words, "He walked with the fallen, and we followed." The walkway became a quiet site near airport terminals, copied in airports across the country. Some called it the honor lane. Others just called it the place where silence spoke. Years later, when that same soldier retired, he didn't make a speech. He just handed his gloves to the next tomb guard, shook a few hands, and quietly walked away. But not before a young soldier, barely 21 and nervous in his new uniform, stopped him. "Sir," he asked, "how did you know when to stand?" "Up?" The veteran turned, offered a small smile, and said, "You don't wait for permission to do what's right. You just don't move when it matters." Then he walked off, leaving behind footsteps so deeply imprinted in hearts that they would never fade. The uniform came off, the medals stored in a wooden box, the boots shelved in a corner, but the story remained. It would be told again and again, in quiet voices, in airports, in living rooms, in schools, in the silence before a casket lands on the tarmac. Because on that day in the airport, when one man refused to move, an entire nation stood still with him, and it moved them all. In the months that followed, something quietly spread. It started small. One airport in the Midwest added a new policy, then another. Terminal managers who had heard about the story, some through news whispers, others through passengers with tears in their voices, met behind closed doors and made decisions that had never been made before. Signs began to appear near security lines. "Military escort present. Please observe silence and respect." A small bell was installed at several terminals. Whenever a fallen soldier's casket passed through, the bell rang once. Just once. No speech, no spotlight. One sound to honor, the one who could no longer make any. Then came the letters. The Department of Defense received thousands, some handwritten in crayon by children, others typed in shaky font by aging veterans, some from foreign travelers who had witnessed that airport moment and felt something they didn't have a name for, but knew they carried home. One letter, sent from a high school principal, read, "We showed your story to the entire school. 40 teenagers stood up and cried. They don't do that for anything, but they did it for you." Another, from a man who once burned his uniform after war broke him, wrote, "You reminded me of what I once believed. Thank you for waking something inside me I thought was dead." But perhaps the most profound reaction came not in words, but in the actions of strangers. At airports across the country, civilians started doing something new. When they saw a soldier walking alone, they stood, without asking, without needing a reason. They stood, not to applaud, not to stare, just to say, "You are not invisible." It became a quiet phenomenon. People began to watch, not out of curiosity, but out of honor. And still, the soldier who began it all never asked for recognition. He returned home eventually, not to fame, not to medals, but to a quiet neighborhood where kids played in the yard and nobody knew what he had done. He liked it that way. One morning, he received a knock on his door. A boy, maybe 11, maybe 12, stood holding a folded note and a plastic flag. "My dad said you're the reason he rejoined my life." The soldier took the note, nodded, and gave the boy a firm handshake. Inside, he read it. "You stood still, and because of that, I knew I had to move." It was signed simply, "A father." Time moved on. The soldier aged, his hair grayed. His back ached from years of walking marble steps and silent paths. But once a year, he visited the airport, not for a flight, just to stand at the walkway, the one with the names of soldiers and the words carved in stone. Sometimes someone would recognize him, sometimes not, but every time he stood there, someone would fall into silence beside him, not knowing why, only knowing it felt right. On one such visit, he noticed a young girl, maybe 7, kneel beside the stone letters and whisper, "Something." He bent slightly and asked, "What did you say?" She looked up with wide eyes and answered, "I told them thank you for not being alone." He didn't speak. He only nodded. And for the first time in many years, he let a tear fall without shame. Later, as he walked away, someone asked him quietly, "Was it worth it, the stand you took?" He paused for a long moment before answering. "It wasn't a stand," he said. "It was a promise, one I never made out loud, but one I kept anyway." And with that, he disappeared once again into the crowd. But the story stayed behind. Now, whenever a casket is carried onto a plane, there's often someone walking behind, and every now and then someone on that plane will close their book, take off their headphones, and stand up, not because they have to, but because they remember the story, the one where the world was rushing, but one man didn't. He stood still, so others could remember what it meant to walk with the fallen, and ever since that day, none of them have walked alone. Years rolled forward. The memory of the moment at the airport didn't fade. It spread like roots beneath the surface, unseen by most, but powerful in those who felt it. A quiet tradition began to form across the country, and even across borders. Military academies started telling the story to their newest cadets, not from a podium, but in a quiet room, lights low, a single video clip showing the moment when a soldier stood in defiance of indifference. It wasn't taught as a protocol or case study. It was spoken like a vow. They called it the day the uniform walked alone. But what no one knew, what no press ever captured, was how that single decision began to reach places far from that. Terminal. In a rural town where the American flag had long been weathered and ignored, an elementary school principal repainted it and had it raised again. When asked why, she replied, "Because we once forgot." but someone reminded us how to remember. In a hospital where veterans waited hours for care, a nurse who'd seen the story online began staying late. "They shouldn't feel invisible," she said. "Not on my watch." In a prison where a former soldier served time, an old warden walked up to him, laid a hand on his shoulder and said, "I read about a man who walked beside a casket like it was the highest honor. I don't know what brought you here, but I know you once stood tall. You still can." And then, across the ocean, in a war-torn country where a young boy had lost his father, a translator for U.S. troops, the boy held a printed photo of the airport scene in his pocket, folded so many times it had faded. "This," he whispered, once to his younger brother, "is how real people say goodbye." Back at home, the walkway near the terminal had grown. Visitors now placed things there, photos, medals, boots, even simple rocks with names painted in black marker. People didn't speak much when they came. They just stood. Some prayed, others cried, some saluted. Most just looked and breathed, slower than before, like standing there helped them remember someone they didn't even know. One morning, a little girl arrived with her father. He wore a prosthetic leg and had a scar that traced from his temple to his jaw. The girl laid down a single stuffed bear and whispered, "For the man who stood still." Her father knelt behind her, a single tear streaking his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. "I was supposed to be on that flight," he said softly. "But I missed it. And when I saw what happened later, I realized I was meant to see it from the outside." She looked up at him. "Did you know the man who stood still?" He smiled through the ache in his chest. "I think we all do now." And, far away, in a quiet home surrounded by oak trees and silence, the soldier lived simply. He kept no trophies, no headlines on the walls, just a box by the door. Inside, folded notes from strangers who had found strength in what he did. Sometimes, he opened the box. Sometimes he just sat near it and closed his eyes. He never gave interviews, never wrote a book, never stood on a stage, but he still stood. One morning he received a letter from someone unexpected. It was from the child of the fallen soldier. Now grown, now wearing a uniform. The letter was brief. "You walked with my father when I was too young to understand, but I understand now, and I will walk for others, as you did, as he would have." And then, beneath that, proudly standing in your footsteps. That day, the old soldier didn't speak, but for the first time in years, he put on the uniform, not for a ceremony, not for the world, just to remember what it meant to wear it. Looked at himself in the mirror, older, slower, still standing. Then he opened his front door, stepped outside, and looked at the rising sun. And for a brief, perfect moment, it was as if all the souls who had ever fallen were there with him, walking beside him, saluting silently, and then disappearing into the wind. The world never saw him again after that. But the story never stopped. Walking, because now it walks through every gate, every tarmac, every hallway of grief and honor, because now someone always stands, even when no one is looking, even when no one asks, even when the world moves too fast to care, someone remembers to pause, to lift their head, and to honor the ones who gave everything, all because one man, in one moment, refused to move. Airport staff stop tomb guard, escorting fallen soldier. What happens next will move you. A solemn tomb guard, known for guarding the tomb of the unknown soldier, enters a bustling airport to escort a fallen soldier's casket home. Without seeking attention, he carries a folded American flag and tries to fulfill his duty. However, airport staff stop him, questioning his authorization and refusing him access through security. Calm but resolute, he refuses to step aside, standing his ground out of deep respect and commitment. A Gold Star grandmother, the fallen soldier's own grandmother, steps forward and reveals she personally requested this honor. The crowd around them becomes silent and reverent, forming an impromptu human honor guard. The airline staff allow the soldier to proceed, and passengers on board the flight sit in total silence as he accompanies the casket. The event spreads across the nation. Airports begin implementing policies to honor military escorts. People across the country start standing silently when they see service members. Letters pour in. Lives change. Veterans reconnect with their dignity. Children learn what honor means. A walkway is built at the airport in memory of the moment, engraved simply, "He walked with the fallen, and we followed." Years later, the soldier lives quietly, declining fame. But the legacy of his one silent stand ripples across generations, inspiring others to live with honor, to remember sacrifice, and to always stand when it matters.